Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I want to thank you all for coming out today to the Palm Springs Air Museum. It's such a delight to look out and see the crowd. I know I've seen quite a few of you coming out to all of our 65th anniversary programs. For those of you that this is your first time to the museum today, thank you as well. These programs that we've been doing here at the museum are commemorating the 65 years since the end of World War II. We started off, boy, it seems like decades ago now, but it's just been a few months ago with the Road to War. And today now we're at the Road to Tokyo. But before we get started... All right, so now without any further ado, I'm going to go ahead and ask our first speaker to come up. Our first speaker today is a United States Marine. I'm told there's no such thing as an ex-Marine. Right, Les? That's right. Les Carlisle made 4 beach landings in the Pacific during World War II. And I assure you, none of those 4 was anything like a vacation on Maui. Iwo Jima, Okinawa, Saipan, Tinian. Les, come on up and tell us about it, would you please? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Greg. Made one mistake. I wasn't Okinawa. That was Kwajalein instead of Okinawa. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming. May I have the first slide, Glenn? After the Japanese victory at Pearl Harbor, they continued to be aggressive and press very aggressively out in the Pacific until they reached the limits shown by the red line out there. That stretched from the Aleutians in the north down through almost to Australia, from Burma in the east, and almost to Hawaii in the west. That was a vast, vast empire. And they spread like a cancer out there. It was just almost instantaneously. Within a couple, 3 months, they had occupied, from Japan, occupied that entire area. The American decision, as they slowly got their wits about them, was to bypass the Carolines and the Palau Islands and concentrate their efforts in 2 directions. One in the south. Let me see if this will work. MacArthur and the Army had been in New Guinea, and they started up the western Pacific. Admiral Nimitz and the Marines were directed up through this area. Nimitz felt at the heart of... good, thank you. I was getting the feedback there. Is this working? Everybody hear it?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. The first efforts out here had been in after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor and this setback. America was really at its depths, and but in 8 months, in the end of 42, August of 42, over they attacked Guadalcanal, and that was kind of the start of the road back. It was the first victory we had. It was followed in November of 42 at Tarawa over here, and eventually directly above that at Kwajalein in the Gilbert Islands. So I was a part of that too, and there's some artwork up here that shows some of those things. As I said, it was decided to bypass Palau. MacArthur had received permission to come up through the Western Pacific and back up through the Philippines to fulfill his promise of "I shall return," his famous speech. But as I said, Nimitz saw it differently, and he wanted to go up directly, coming up through the Central Pacific. Kind of struck like a dagger into directly up at the heart of Japan. And the key to this whole thing was the B-29 was being developed, and it was a very long-range bomber, and it could go through these wide expanses. Blaine? After, let me get the next one here in a minute. The first step in the long road back was in the Marianas Islands, and from the islands in the Marianas, the Between Islands could reach Japan, which was what we were ultimately looking for. And all these islands that we were going to, the main reason for taking them was to get the airfield, and of course deny them the use to the enemy. Saipan and Tinian, these are the larger islands out there. There's several islands in the Marianas chain. They had been mandated to Japan. Japan came in World War I mainly to keep the Germans out of those areas, and they had seized those islands after World War I. However, eventually, when the spoils were split up, the League of Nations mandate was that the Japanese officially had possession and owned those islands. Guam had been in U.S. possession since 1898, the Spanish-American War, and that was a different story. But that fell on December 11th, 4 days after Pearl. Next plane. These are just some of the dimensions, some of the indications of what Saipan is. It was a fairly good-sized island by island, as islands go. Let's see. Can't read that. The 2nd Marines and the 4th Marines were in there with the 27th Army. It was very rugged terrain. There we go. There was a ridge of high ground, kind of a spine through it. And in this area up in here, the high ground, the highest point of the island was Mount Tapachau, which was 1,500 feet. I'm going to use mountains a couple times. I use it in another one too. A mountain, these are not mountains, they're hills. But of course they look like mountains at the time. The decision was to go in on the south. The invasion beaches were at the south here. There's a town of Sharon Canoa. There were 2 towns, Garapan and up here, and Sharon Canoa. And the 2 Marine divisions came in here. The idea was to go across those south beaches, bisect the island, get the airfield, which is down in this area, and then head north. Next plane. That says kind of the same thing. There were a couple of interesting things that happened here. When the landings occurred, there within the first 2 hours, we had about 8,000 people ashore. And we quickly established a beachhead about 6 miles wide and a half-mile deep. Made good progress. We brought there were 3 things that come to mind as outstanding over here. One was, right after we got in, we had an inter-service problem of major proportions. The Marines were on the 2 flanks, the 2nd and the 4th Marines, and the Army Division was in the center. Well, the Marines and the Army have a little different philosophy of battle. The Army is very deliberate. As the line approaches, as they run into some obstacle, they stop the line, take care of it, and move forward as a unit. It takes a little longer, and of course, the longer you fight, the more casualties you have. Marine philosophy is a little different. They go in, and their whole idea is to, with overwhelming force, break all the lines of communication organization, and it's more of a rough and tumble type thing. If they come to a trouble spot, they put a crew around it, bypass it, and keep on going. We end up with higher initial casualties, but the battle is shorter. Whether it's a push or not, I've never seen any numbers on that. But on Saipan, we did have a problem. We had the Marines on either side, and the Army here. And eventually, with the Army's approach, they slowed up, and with all due respects, they did catch some of the heavier fighting, we'll admit that. But we got a gap between the two of them. And of course, the Japanese up on this side took advantage of that, and they started pouring through that gap into the flanks of the Marines here. Our General Holland M. Smith, who was also known as Howland Mad, but not to his face, of course, he insisted that the Army move out, but he had some problems with him. And eventually, he came over, took command, fired the Army general. They shook up the Army division, which was a National Guard outfit, and it came in intact. And they reorganized it down to battalion level. And eventually, it started to iron out, and we got back to business. Oops, I'm out of line here. Okay, next, please, Blaine. No, that's one, go back one. Okay, yeah. As we progressed up the island, and I'm kind of just trying to hit the highlights, the Japanese made a major banzai attack, and this was a well-organized and well-planned attack. They hit the 2nd and the 27th very hard. I understand the Marine artillery was being fired point blank, kind of like Gettysburg, if you can visualize that. They had their fuses cut to 0.2 of a second, and actually getting shrapnel bouncing off the rocks from that. The Japanese suffered very heavy losses, and so did the Marines. This was one of the big major battles out there, and it's something that nobody ever forgets. And next one, Blaine. Finally, probably the most horrifying thing and awful thing that you'd ever want to imagine was the Japanese committing suicide in mass numbers. As we pushed them up to that end of the island, a lot of them the civilians started to surrender, and they received pretty good treatment. And of course, the Americans were broadcasting through various things, various communication lines back to Japan that prisoners were being taken and treated well. That upset the Emperor of Japan because he figured that would have a major effect on morale, and obviously that wasn't to be accepted. And the Emperor issued an order that the civilians were to commit suicide rather than surrender to the Americans. They had already heard bad things about the Americans anyhow, and they did in mass numbers. There was we went up, they set loudspeakers up, and everything we did to talk them out of it. We had some of the recently taken Japanese prisoners speaking, who had, once they found out we weren't going to kill them, they became cooperative, and they were pleading with some of these people to come back. But there was a mass suicide, and this is this is the major suicide cliff. This is the east end of it. It extends out along away from this view down along the coastline, and they jumped over to mass numbers. It was estimated maybe 5,000 of them. This is men, women, children. The women would either hold their children in their hands or throw the children over. It was just an absolutely terrifying thing that never should have happened. The final results, you can see those numbers. They're pretty horrifying. One of the things, the thing that runs through this whole presentation is that the Japanese had a Bushido code which insisted that they never surrender and give up. And coupled that with the fact that they were confined on an island, it just made an impossible situation. And it basically, hardly any of them survived this type of thing. And that shows the relative losses. I don't want to dwell on them too much. Now the next one, please. Following Saipan, we had about 2 weeks to recover and lick our wounds and try to get cleaned up. And we boarded ship again and sailed across a very narrow channel to the island of Tinian, which is 3 miles away. That's when we took Saipan, the southern end, they set up the 155 long toms, heavy artillery, to subdue Tinian and keep it under cover. So they knew we were coming. There were about 8,000 of them on it. They knew we were coming, and they just kind of hid out and went underground and to wait the inevitable. Tinian was a little smaller than Saipan, but there were about 8,000 to 9,000 people over there as troops. And we have the next we already had that. Excuse me. Can you go back to the map? Two back. I'm sorry. I got you out of sync. Okay. The main landing beaches, the only decent landing beach on there was over by Tinian town, this area in here, and there were some fairly open sandy beaches, and Tinian town there was a series of hills behind it. The town was in kind of like the base of an amphitheater. And the Japanese took advantage of that, realizing it was the only place to come in, only really suitable place to come in, and they heavily defended that area. And but our scouts had gone in there, and they found out that there were, up in the north end of the island, there were 2 very small beaches. And even though there's a coral reef around, which meant we had to funnel into it, it was decided to make the landings on those beaches. And to cover the landing, the 2nd Marines were sent off the southern end of the island, over down in this area, on the ships. They went over the side into the landing barges, actually formed up, and they would circle around, go in behind the transport, climb back up the ladders, walk across the transport, get back into the landing barges. Now, of course, the Japanese, observing them from, this is 3 miles away probably, it just looked like a lot more people coming. And they realized this would be the attack. But we actually formed waves and sent waves of people started in on the beach. And of course, all the Japanese that were up in this area rushed down to that area. Well, when that happened, we put a wall of fire across to block it off just below the beaches here. Those long toms I mentioned were over on Saipan, and the Navy carrier ships just put a wall of fire down. And the Marines came in on those two little beaches, and we landed 15,000 people there by nightfall. Show the next one, please, Blaine. No, the next one. Okay, there are the 2 beaches. This one, the upper beach, Beach White 1, which is the one I landed on, was 65 yards wide. Beach White 2 down here was 130, 140, I think I said 150 on the slide, 150 feet. And we put, I'd say, 15,000 people ashore in one day in those beaches. When we did, it took the Japs by surprise. They recovered rather quickly, and that first night on there, they mounted a major attack. It was an extremely well organized attack. They had light artillery, tanks, bazookas, not bazookas, but mortars and so forth. And they attacked very heavily along the entire line. They proceeded with an artillery attack, and I remember hearing the stuff landing all around us. It was a fairly bright night, as I recall, and they came across the open fields. The Marines had dug in the tree lines in the side. They were in the shadows. And to make a long story short, when it all cleared up in the morning, we counted over 1,200 killed and enemy dead out in front, and it was estimated another 800 to 900 had been dragged away. This is about 25% of their force, and it really just killed them, literally. And that was in effect the Battle of Saipan, the Battle of Tinian. For them, it was just a matter of mopping up, which took about a week or so. As on Saipan, these are suicide cliffs, and that shows one of the watery places. This was directly on the water, and you kind of get an idea of the steepness and so forth. Once the island was secured, and we didn't know much of this was going on, but it was going on while we were still there. The 2 atom bombs that had been prepared were brought in, and this is pit number 1. The bombs were so big that they couldn't load them directly onto the B-29s. They had to dig a pit, pull the airplane over it, hoist the bomb into it. And this is pit number 1, and pit number 2 was right next to it. Both the attacks, both bombs were they were both loaded out of pit 1 and onto the airplanes. And this is runway Able on the North Field. And I have to tell you, when I stood here and realized what this signified, this was the start of the atomic era, right at this point. And it's a feeling that I had once before when I had visited Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, which was the birth of aviation. And those 2 events had such an effect on our lives. It's just an awesome feeling. Okay. This again is a summary of, it shows the one-sidedness of the situation. Say there was not much of a way out for those people. Okay. About 100 miles away, south of Saipan Tinian, is the island of Guam. And originally, that had been scheduled for an assault on, about 5 days after the assault on Saipan. But because of the events on Saipan and the opposition, it was delayed, and for about a month. Again, the landings were in the south on each side of the main island of the main port of Agra. This was an important base because it was the only deep water port in the whole area. And it also contained 2 airfields. And I mentioned everything was all about getting an airfield. Okay, next, please. It was intended to be, it was important because with that deep water thing, it became a staging ground for the Philippines and subsequent operations. And, okay, next please. We're going through these rather early because I don't want to. This again shows you the number of people we had on both sides. I'm going to eventually, later today, talk about Iwo Jima, and everybody knows that flag raising. This is the flag raising, kind of an unobtrusive thing that happened on Guam. It kind of pleased these people a great deal. One of the interesting things that about after the battle, there were a lot of holdouts. A lot of the Japanese, some of them didn't know the war was over. But this guy, Sergeant Tokio, took it to extremes. He held out for 27 years. by himself on Guam. He dug a cave. He was up in an area where a stream ran. It was a beautiful area. We visited it, and on my last trip back there, and he had a cave. Let me see. Got the numbers here. It was about 75 feet deep, but inside it measured about 10 feet from end to end, and he had about 3 feet of crawl space, and this was an air vent, and this was his way out. And if you show the next one, this shows the interior of it, and you get an idea how this man lived for 27 years, which is absolutely hard to believe. He eventually came out and became a subject of ridicule after a while in Japan, and fled. He left and went elsewhere. Actually ran for Congress in the Japanese Congress, the Japanese Diet. To wrap this up, while I was there in 2005, out in the horizon, this is directly off the landing beaches, but there's several ships out here, probably about 6 in all, and these are standby ships. They were loaded with 3 months' supplies of ammo and food and everything to serve as an emergency wherever the next critical situation would arise in that area. And as far as I know, they're still there. Okay, let me see. And that concludes this part of it. That's all I have to say.
Hello. First off, I would like to verify everything he said was true. I was there. The little parts of the story about all of the women and children that committed suicide, it was absolutely astounding. There was so many in the water. It just made us sick. But I'm not here to tell his story, I'm here to tell mine. So we'll go back to the beginning. I want to explain one thing. I'm very prejudiced to the boats that were involved in the invasion force. People that don't think about it, but everything that it takes to fight a war had to go from the ships to the shore. There had been no war without those boats. The boats were 36 feet long. They held 30 troops. The front of them had a big ramp that dropped down, and I was, in the beginning, I was a boat coxswain. A coxswain is the guy that drives the boat. And we picked up our 36 men and headed for the beach. When we got close to the beach, all of the ships that were at sea opened up with their big guns on the coast. And you'd swear they were only 2 feet over your head because of all of the force of the shells were going and exploding in front of you. It's a thing that just really gets to you because you know what's going to happen. As soon as you drop your run, the machine gunners of the Japanese forces aim right into your boat. And they do this. I was there. we lost about half of the soldiers in my boat. The planes overhead, the Corsairs here and the other one back here were strafing back and forth as we made our landings. It was quite an exciting time. But eventually I got my boat turned around because we couldn't get within, probably the distance of this room from the beach because of the coral reefs. But we had to let the Marines or the soldiers out on the reefs, and they were on their own. We got the heck out of there. We went back out to the ships, we hoisted the wounded aboard and then went over and got another 36 boys and headed for the beach again as fast as we could go. We did this for days, and eventually we killed every single Jap on the island. The first island that I went to was down in the let's see, I don't want to forget the Macon Island in the Gilberts. After that was done, I went back to the ship, hoisted us aboard, back to Hawaii, picked up another shipload, headed out to sea to the Marshall Islands. He mentioned the Marshalls, and that was quite a, well, it wasn't like Saipan, but it was almost. Thousands were killed, and they wouldn't give up, so we had to kill them. We begged them to give up, but we had to just destroy everything. Eniwetok was another island. Then back to Hawaii, picked up another load, headed to Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, and went through the process of gradually, well, I don't know quite how to put it. We had the Marines and the Army. They had different ways of doing things. I was, as an enlisted sailor, I was in an unusual situation because I ran the boat that belonged to Admiral Turner, who was in charge of the Navy. And he supplied me to General Smith of the Marines. And much to my amazement, I got to listen to all the conversation between the generals and the admirals regarding how they're supposed to do things. And the previous speaker was absolutely correct. There was no cooperation at all between the Army and the Marines. At the time, and listening to these guys, and they never asked me what my opinion was, and always that bothered me. But they would argue and fight and yell and holler at each other. The fact that the Marines wanted the charge they had on Saipan, and the Army wanted to hold tight and go slowly, was very true. And I was personally all for the Army. I didn't like the idea of all these Marines being killed. The old shoot 'em up Smith, he didn't care. It was charge ahead and get those Japs. Anyhow, that's another story. I went from there back to Pearl, picked up some more, and went to the Philippines, and went to Lady Gulf, and that's what we wanted to talk about here. The Lady Gulf was not the same as the other invasions. We landed into a jungle. The Japs had already found out that if they stay down on the coast, they're going to get killed. So that they backed up quite a ways away. So our landings were somewhat free of being attacked. But this, as soon as they got situated on the beach, then the Japanese opened up with the big guns back away from the beach. And it was pretty bloody. I'd like to leave Lady Gulf for a moment, and the next invasion that I was involved in was the Luzon, the northern part of the Philippines, which is just as big as the Lady Gulf invasion. And then there was also Subic Bay, several places that we had to go in. When that was finished, we went down to Borneo and took in the Australians, which was an interesting experience dealing with the Australians. They're a bunch of rugged guys, and Borneo was the most rugged land that we ever tried to take. It was solid jungle. You just took a big knife and had to cut your way no matter where you went. And it was about 100 degrees, both with heat and water pouring out of your body. It was just terrible. Don't ever go there. But we went to the northern end of it, which is Bruni Bay, and then over to the other side of the island, and went in again. That was a place called Tarakan. And we dumped all of the poor Australians on this godforsaken place. And then we took off and went back to Guam. I'm not Guam, I'm sorry, back to Lady Gulf. While we're in Lady Gulf, one of the things that happened every morning was as the sun would come up, the Japanese would be right in the middle of that sun, coming at you with the aircraft. And when the sun would go down, they're right in the middle of the sun as it goes down. You can't see them. But the big difference is that they didn't pull out of their dives. They would dive, come in so low that one of them hit the mast of the ship next to us, and the admiral gave the ship a commendation for knocking the Japanese Zero out of the sky with his mast. But that happened every morning. You woke up and you knew you had to deal with these kamikaze Japanese. Later on, when we went up to Luzon, we looked up, and right straight over our head was probably 100 Japanese flying around up there. They were so high we couldn't shoot at them. was out of our range. So we sat there and waited and waited and waited. And you talk about you're having a funny feeling in your stomach when you know that that sucker's gonna come after you. And suddenly, after probably 2 or 3 hours, they screamed out, commence firing, and down they came. They mainly headed for the carriers. They loved to hit those, and they did. They blew them out of the water. They blew into the, all the different kinds of ships. But when they would finally get down to the level of the water, they would just keep going until they ran into a ship. It was very, very scary. And one of the things that they didn't bother to tell us, that everything that you shot straight up in the air comes down. And all of a sudden, all this stuff was banging all over the place on the deck, and we all ran for cover. And several of the fellows aboard ship were wounded. I was fortunate. But the only other thing that happened in Leyte Gulf that was very involved, and part of the major story was that the Japanese Navy attacked us when we were in the Philippines, and half of their Navy came in from the south and half from the north. But because of these pilots, they gave them such a bad time that they turned around and left. And they didn't have to. One of the luckiest things we were ever encountered was when the Japanese quit. If they had gone just a little bit further, they'd been right into Leyte Gulf, and they could have wiped out 100 ships. Well, sea stories can go on and on. I'll back out now and let somebody else do some talking. Thank you.
Hello again. I'm going to talk about Iwo Jima and fast as I can. Iwo Jima was particularly strong in my mind. It was such an intense battle. It was a month of just unbelievable. It was something exploding or happening every time. And what little sleep you got didn't amount to an awful lot. Just to show you, Iwo Jima is kind of a pork-shaped island. Over on this side is Mount Suribachi. It's not really a mountain, as I mentioned when I was talking about Saipan. It's only 555 feet high, not exactly a mountain. Except if you're at the base of it, looking up, it did look like a mountain. And those 5th Marines went up there and had a terrible job because the Japs were, and excuse me if I use that term, that was the term at the time. It's not politically correct anymore, but I hope I haven't slipped up too many times. But the island, there was a narrow isthmus, a neck through here was fairly narrow, and eventually rose up into high ground over on the other side. The high ground over there, up in this particular area, the highest spot was Hill 382, and the hills were named for their elevation. So that's 382 feet above sea level. And that's actually, I'm going to mention that in a little bit, that's actually where the toughest fighting really occurred. And there was an airfield, a main airfield, Moriyama #1 was here. Right behind it was number 2, and there was a third one under construction up in the north island, north end of the island, which we didn't, we never got to, it never got completed is what I'm trying to say. The landing beaches were right along this area right here. The Second Marines landed about this half of it, went across the island, cut the island. They did that in the first day, and then started up Mount Suribachi. The 4th Marines came in here and swept up through the airfield and then turned north. The 5th Marines, once they got Mount Suribachi, came up and joined us, and we swept up the island abreast this way. Next, please. These are the stats. The Japanese had about 22,000 men in there. We put 2 Marine divisions in there, and we had a third one, and 2/3 of the 3rd Marines came in. 2 regiments of the 3rd were used. One of the important things to me is that number right there. This island was only 8 square miles, and to give you an idea of what that. Okay, this is the strategic importance was that it was midway, almost exactly between the Marianas, where the B-29s were based, and the Tokyo area. Hold it before you go there. Just hold on there for a minute. The B-29s had about 1,300 miles to fly up there and 1,300 back. And this gave them just about 15-20 minutes over target, very short time over target. And that's if they flew almost directly over Iwo Jima. If they avoided it, circumvented it, it cut the time down, and it was just they couldn't do it. So as a consequence, what would happen is they'd fly up there, the Japanese fighters on Iwo would rise up and attack them and damage some of them. They'd have to turn back. As they proceeded on up, the radar, they had a lot of radar on that island, not a lot of, but they had radar on the island, and so they raided up so the Japanese homeland knew when they were coming and how many. And at that time, up in the Japanese mainland, their fighters would rise up and beat these guys. They drop their bombs as it could, and coming back, they had to pass Iwo again, where they were struck again. So on every mission, those B-29s got hit 3 times, which was unbelievable. They had unbelievable losses, and it was so bad that there was serious thought given to stopping the B-29 raids, which would have been a severe hampering of the effort. I mentioned 8 square miles. Here's what it looks like imposed on a map of Palm Springs. This is Highway 10 up here, and the bottom road, this is Ramon Road. There's the airport where we are right now. This is Gene Autry, and this is Indian Canyon. So if you get an idea, those who are familiar with the area or live here, that shows you just how small this island is. 8 square miles is not a very big island. There are 22,000 Japanese on it, and we put about 70,000 Marines in onto that. There was a intense preparation for it. Actually, I understand that the bombardment exceeded that of D-Day in Europe. It was incredible. They hit that island for 72 straight days, very intensely. B-24s flying up in the Marianas and the naval ships. And as bad as the 72 days was, the last 3, it really got intense, and they poured everything they had into it. It was unbelievable. We pulled in the day before and watched the bombardment, and the island was obscured. You couldn't see it. It was smoke and dust and everything. We just thought the island had probably disappeared by that time. We just couldn't believe anything was going to happen. However, the official report was we did minimal damage to the island. It was essentially almost untouched to all practical purposes. In fact, they increased their defenses while they were being bombed during that time. And the secret to that was they were underground. When we got there, we were on the island and they were in the island. They had 17 miles of tunnels dug in there and over 1,500 caves and pillboxes and outlets coming up. The General Kurabayashi was up in the area of the north where I told you. He had his cave was essentially 3 stories underground. They dug down 70 feet into this island, and they were awful hard to get out of there. Next, please, Lane. There were a couple of real memorable events. One was, of course, Suribachi, and it wasn't called that. There was a name that sounded like Suribachi, but the Marines called it. That's where the flag was raised. And there are actually 2 flags. I won't go into that very much, but the first one went up. There was a Marine who lived here in town. In fact, I think he's still here with us. He was one of the first 8 to get up on Mount Suribachi. And as tough as the fighting had been, it kind of eased off. And when the final day they made the push, they got up to the top and were essentially the Japanese had held their fire. So the patrol went back and said, "Bring the flag up." And then the flag came up, and there's a famous picture of that first one, which was a very small flag. It's now in the Marine Museum in Virginia. And it was eventually replaced by the larger flag. The other thing I remember very clearly is I mentioned Hill 382, and the taking of that area was very intense. There was a complex called Amphitheater Turkey Knob, and they always have those kind of names that the Marines put on it. It was about 3 city blocks in area. And during that, in about a week and a half of fighting over there were 8,000 Marines committed, and about 4,000 of them ended up as casualties. It was probably the most intense fighting on the whole island. Okay, next please. Kind of a score. All but about 1,000 of the Japanese perished, and the interesting thing is, over here, the Marines suffered very heavy losses. About 6,800 and 19,000 wounded. You put those 2 numbers together, and they exceed this number. This is the first and only battle the Marine Corps ever had where their casualties exceeded those of they inflicted on the enemy. And that's a very dubious honor to have, I'll tell you. Okay. When I was back there in 2005, that was my second trip. I went back in 20 years prior to that, and in 2005 we went back. And this is the landing beaches. I'm standing up on Mount Suribachi, which you can now drive up to. That we drove up, thank God, because I don't know if I could have climbed up there. The 5th Marines landed down on this side, and we landed up on the other end. 5th came over here and across the island, and there's an area up here called the Boat Basin, and where I landed was right up into that area. Next, please. This is a view from, they call Green Beach, was the closest beach to Mount Suribachi, and that's a big dome up there, and you get an idea of the sand. You've heard a lot about that Iwo Jima sand, and you can see it in the foreground. If you'd sink it up to your ankles, it was very tough to go in there. I was weighed about 150 pounds, about what I am now, not much different. Carrying a radio on my back, and we plowed through this stuff. On the last one, there was the side of it showed you the terrace, how steep those terraces were over here. And you'd climb up this terrace, get your way to the top, and you think you're going to see something, and all you saw was another terrace. It leveled out, and there was another terrace. It just went on endlessly. It seemed like we were never going to get up to the top, sinking in, as I said, up to at least your ankles, all the way up there. Iwo Jima was, to me, I thought the idea was just a big solid dome. This is a view of the crater. It's a collapsed volcanic crater, and I just put this in there just for my own satisfaction. I was staggered to see that. I had always thought of it as just a big rock. This is up on top. This is the American monument on top. That's my younger son and I standing there. Okay. And here I am, this, right down below, that's the exact spot where the flag was raised. It's kind of a very historic spot, certainly to the Marines. This marker was dedicated by James Bradley, whose father was one of the flag raisers. And you see the other beach over there. This is the monument that we dedicated 20 years ago in 1985. And it has English, American on this side, and a tribute to the people, and Japanese. There's a similar Japanese version of it on the other side. At the monument, I put this in because this guy is named Jack Lucas, and he holds a particular spot in my heart for a lot of reasons. One main reason. Jack threw himself on a hand grenade. And before it went off, a second one came down, and he pulled the second hand grenade under him. So he survived. During the battle, a lot of the Marines took battle flags off. The Japanese, a lot of them carried the rising sun, and people would write good luck on it and all that kind of thing. And this is returning those battle flags to one of the widows of one of the people that died on the island. If you can see her face, it's just a study in emotion. Thank you. And I put this in. This is I just love this picture. It came out so beautifully, and it shows the Marines, Marine flag, the American flag, and the Japanese flag. And this is I just thought one of the outstanding pictures that I took. This time I'd like to introduce Roy June. Roy was a P-51 pilot over there, and is going to tell you his story.
That's a hard act to follow. The B-29's Superforts on Saipan and Tinian started their long-range flights to Japan in late 1944. They made these runs without any fighter protection of any kind. And as Les indicated to you, they caught it from Iwo Jima, they caught it from Japan, they caught it from just about any place the Japanese could get at it. In 1945, the early part, our P-51 Mustangs were on fields in Guam, waiting for an opportunity to fly up to Iwo and start our long-range missions to Japan. The first time that the field number 1 was available, we started bringing our aircraft in from Guam, and there was plenty of holes in the runway, and we lost about every 10th aircraft by dipping into a hole that hadn't yet been filled. We started our long-range missions. Well, let me first say that when we came in with our airplanes, we had the airfield plus I think about 300 yards, and the Marines and the Japanese had the rest of the island. As we would take off, they would pot shoot at us. Just as our aircraft left the ground, almost we start to get hits. So the CO says, turn around, boys, we'll fly downwind. We'll take off downwind. Well, downwind takes you right straight into Mount Suribachi. So the minute you left the runway, you had to make a hard right turn or hard left turn, or you'd wind up nose right into the mountain. After a while, when the Marines had taken more of the island, our general met with General Smith, affectionately known as Holland Man Smith. And he said the Navy has been dive bombing for us off the carriers from very high altitude. And of course, as the target shrunk, the more and more of the island that the Marines took, the targets got smaller and smaller. So General Smith asked our General Mickey Moore, and he said, would your guys do some low-level bombing and strafing for us on the north end of the island? And General Moore said, sure, my guys can do anything. Not a single one of us in that squadron that had a single combat mission. All of us 21, 22-year-old greenhorns fly the hell out of the airplane, but we'd never been shot at before. So we had a big meeting with the pilots and with the Marine Command, and they said now there'll be either a yellow smoke line or a yellow line of some sort, and just, I want you to remember, the good guys are on that side, and the bad guys are over here. And when you go up to drop your ordnance, don't drop any ordnance over here on the good guys, drop it on the bad guys. Well, that kind of got us spooked a little bit, so our first few missions, and these are 15 or 20-minute missions, take off from field number 1, go up and drop your bombs and come back down and wait to gas up and load up some more bombs and go up and do the same thing. So our first targets were pretty wild because we were too conscious of that line. Finally, we got it down to where we were supposed to. Right around the 1st of April in 1945, we started our long-range missions to Japan. This is the first time that a land-based fighter aircraft could reach the home islands of Japan. Always before any fighter activity over the home islands was from carrier aircraft. These missions were 8 hours in duration. And I can tell you that sitting in that tight little cockpit of a Mustang for 8 hours is an ordeal. In fact, the second thing that would be more or less a hazard for us, or at least was a presumed hazard, was that we're flying over water pretty much for the first time. Between the island of Iwo Jima and Japan, there are no islands that I know of. So in 8 hours flying over water, you always had it in mind that if that old fan out in front of the nose of the aircraft ever quit, you were going to be in the water. There was no place to go except in the water. This was a kind of a hazard until you try to put that in your mind. Of the 8-hour mission, you could only spend 20 minutes over the target. If you stayed any longer, you were going to run out of fuel on the way back. The Mustang carried auxiliary tanks under each wing, internal fuselage, internal wing tanks had fuel, and even right behind the cockpit was another 85-gallon tank. So we had close to 400 gallons of fuel, which made us almost a flying tanker going up. We used up our wing tanks first, and then used the others as we needed. We flew these missions almost daily from April of 1945 until the end of the war. We protected the B-29 super forts. We also went on individual strafing missions, assigned particular fields. Our biggest hazard, I think, of the whole thing was weather. A lot of our flying was in the typhoon season, and in June 1st, 1945, we sent out 127 Mustangs to strafe a field at Osaka, and we lost 27 of them that never made it to Japan, right in the middle of the typhoon-like storm. the attitude of the pilots, and you can imagine kids 21, 22 years old, flying Mustangs, good pilots, well disciplined in the airplane, but totally undisciplined otherwise. I remember one time we had what they called a duck, and it was a combination sea and land craft. And I don't know where we got it, but we got it someplace. Probably traded something to the Sea Beast for it. And so we got this thing out in the water, and there's a bunch of us on, we're going to go fishing. Well, fishing off the coast of Evil, I don't know what there was. We didn't have any fish poles, we didn't have any bait or anything, but we had a fistful of hand grenades. So what we do, we speed this duck up as fast as we go, and we drop hand grenades off the tail, and we had them all greased up so that they wouldn't get too wet. And when they exploded, they stunned the fish, and the fish would come up to the surface, and we'd go around and gather the fish and bring them into the mess hall, and then the mess sergeant would take a look at them, and he'd only accept about 1 out of 50. So we have fresh fish dinner. And when you're used to eating powdered milk and dehydrated potatoes and spam and so forth, well, sometimes those fish were pretty good. But when I stop and think of the chances we took by tossing grenades off the back of a duck, but when you're 21, 22 years old, you're bulletproof. Anything has a propeller, you can fly it. And with that attitude, I guess that's probably the best attitude you could have when you have to fly one of those aircraft for 8 hours to Japan. We could only spend 20 minutes over the target. If we spend any longer, we're probably going to run out of fuel on the way back. I had one experience where all the gas gauges said empty. I was on the way back from Japan, and so I got rid of the canopy because I thought I was going to have to parachute out. I wasn't going to try and land that aircraft in the water. I was going to parachute, but I managed to get it all the way back and get it down on the runway, and I just pulled off the runway and stopped. And my crew chief came out, the crew chief, the head mechanic of the aircraft, came out with a tug, go back in, and he says, "You do know where the parking area is, don't you, sir?" And I didn't say anything, but I got into the operations office, and the operations officer said, you're going to have to pay for that canopy. I pulled off the aircraft. And I said, well, I thought I wasn't going to make it. I thought I was going to have to parachute, and that's why I got rid of it. He says, yeah, but you got back all right. So they had a rule in our squadron, and this is because of undisciplined pilots sometimes, that if you did something foolish and damaged the aircraft, that it was something that was not required in a combat situation, why you would pay for the damage you did. And he decided that I was going to have to pay for this canopy. So I thought I was justified. I really thought I was not going to make it, so I got rid of the canopy so I could parachute out of the aircraft. So I prepared to fight the thing. I asked my crew chief, I said, how much fuel did I have left? He said, he's about 11, 12 years older than I was, and he said, you're too young to have that information. It will age you. So he wouldn't tell me. So when I went to the CO and I said, I don't want to pay for that canopy because I think I was justified in getting rid of it because all my gas gauges said empty, and I just didn't think I was going to make it back in. He said, who's your crew chief? So I told him, Sergeant Steffi. So he gets on the phone and he calls down to operations and says, I want to speak to Sergeant Steffi. So apparently Steffi got on and they had a conversation back and forth. And the CO said, told me, he says, it was justified, you don't have to pay for the canopy. And I said, how much fuel did I have left? He says, your crew chief says you're too young to have that engine because it will age you. To this day, I don't know how much fuel I have left. I like to think it's only fumes, but anyway, after I was supposed to fly 17 missions, I flew 11. The last one was 2 days after the second atomic bomb was dropped, and there was no war after that. Then the only other thing that really happened to me that was interesting was that I got orders to report back to the Santa Ana Army Air Base in Santa Ana, California. But there was no transportation. So the CO said, well, why don't you hitchhike like the other guys are doing? Had open-end orders to report when I got there. And it took me 6 weeks hitchhiking from island to island to island to get back to Hamilton Field in San Francisco and take a slow train up to Santa Ana. I'll be around afterwards if anybody has any questions. Thank you very much.
Give me something. We have a little, yes, we have a little change in our itinerary, and at this time I'd like to introduce, it hurts me deeply, you have to understand. Those of us like Roy and me were smart enough to have runways stay right where they were when we left them. I'd like to introduce a person who was not quite that smart. He got on one of those moving runways that runs through the water. Ken March, would you come up here and rebut my question? While he's coming up here, Ken was one of these F6F pilots for whom I would never let him know this, but I have deep respect. And he's going to tell you a little bit about the tail end of the war at Okinawa and working with those kamikazes. You're on.
Well, as you know, the first flyer doesn't have a chance. And we were told as cadets to not fly down railroad tracks. And of course we had to ask, why weren't we supposed to do that? You'll run into an Air Force pilot coming the other way. And Blaine already has told me, he said, I'll be more than happy to go aboard an aircraft carrier when they have a 10,000 foot runway on there. I don't think they quite have gotten to that stage yet. To give you some, is there an 18 or 19-year-old sitting out here in the audience? I saw one earlier. Come on, there's one or two back in here. Could you please stand for just a minute? Come on, there's got to be one or two in here. Okay. All right, you're being very bashful. What I wanted to do is compare what we look like back about 60, 70 years ago. You'll notice these other guys were in pretty good shape up here. But when they crawled onto those islands, they were young tigers, and I'll tell you, I have a lot of respect for them. And when they talked about, catching fish and eating that, we had to go back to the carrier and probably have steak and mashed potatoes or something, because after all, they were. Anyway, to get things in perspective, a picture up here in the wall, a painting rather, Stan Stokes did that, and that's referred to as a straight deck carrier. In other words, today they got a lot smarter, and they have an angle, what they call a canted deck, cantilevered. So the pilots come in and land on the cantilevered part, and they take off from the straight part. As you can see, we have no alternative but to land and take off in the same place. My carrier was this was a CVL, which was a little smaller than the big S6 in Yorktown and all those famous fast ones. Mine was half the size of that one. It was a Jeep carrier. It would be about from one wall to the other, about the size of it. And the funny part about it, it had Saucony written on the back of it. It used to be a Saucony tanker. And we refueled other ships while we were out there, which was rather a first for us. But the landing area would be between here and the automobile standing over there. So we had a relatively small area to try to land on, catch a cable, and then taxi forward. How many of you remember Ernie Pyle? Yeah, a lot of you do. That gives you away your age, doesn't it? Ernie Pyle commented in one of his columns that landing on an aircraft carrier was about the same as landing on a main street with a hurricane and a tornado going at the same time. So you can I appreciate the fact that I was able to do it 164 times and not break up the airplane. I'm not sure whether they would have charged me for it or not, but I think we're all still paying for it at this particular time. But I know you've been sitting here for a while, and I don't mean to take anything away from Greg, but I'd like to have all of the volunteers, the men and women, stand for just a minute. Would you all please stand? All the volunteers, yeah, good. All of them. I'm doing this for a reason. Yeah, there you go. Wonderful. The reason I'm doing this, I was one of the founders to get this started, and we weren't aware of how cohesive a group that you would have here. And there's a few of you that are probably sitting home in a Barca lounger trying to think, what am I going to do with the rest of my life? I'm tired of playing golf. I'll tell you, if you come down here, you will meet some of the nicest, well put, greatest guys. Some of my best friends are here, and we've got Bill Hughes in the back. Bill, will you raise your hand, please? Bill Hughes is in charge of all these guys, and that's no small chore. And where's Jerry Sweeney? Jerry? Jerry's around here someplace. The reason I mention it is Bill and Jerry Sweeney put together a wonderful class, and some of the people out here are saying, well, I can't come here and do this. I don't know anything about airplanes. I don't even I've never even been in one or words to that effect. And what you want to do is forget that part of it. These guys put together, along with Blaine, some of the best training that you could expect. And you learn a lot too. It makes it so fun to come down here, and then you'll become a docent. That's what they refer to us. And that you answer questions from people that come on in here. A little funny story, I finally finished the docent training, and gosh, I was just so anxious to tell whoever would come in here all about it. This tall, lanky fellow came in. He walked up to the little F4F when I happened to fly along. I flew about 5 of these here. But the F4F, and he walked up to it, and I was about to say, what can I tell you about this airplane? I knew everything about it, of course. And he said, he nudged me, he said, look, my name is on the side of the airplane. It was Joe Foss. So and all you have to do as a docent is say, did you fly this, or did you have somebody in the family? From there on, they do all the talking, and you just walk around with them and have a good time. But you have a wonderful group of people. Now, if you decide to become a docent, I'll get around to the kamikazes in a minute. I'd like to give a pitch on this, because you make this one of the best museums in the whole world, I'll tell you. And you come here and you meet some wonderful people and say, but if you could just be interested a little bit, write your name down on the program that you have, give it to Bill Hughes. Jerry Sweeney's around someplace. You can give him and give it to him. They can get in touch with you and get you into a class, which I think is going to start very shortly. And you'll learn a lot. You'll meet some wonderful people, and you can tell stories about what you did, and you know your wife was tired of hearing those stories, so you got a whole new audience that you can work with on that. All right, a couple of stories on kamikazes. I was on the small carrier, as I said, and one of the things we had to do is we took off and we climbed, 4 of us would climb to 10,000 feet, and another 4 would go up to 20, and we'd fly over the whole fleet, and the object was to be there on stage before the Japanese, the kamikaze, came on down. Or when they did, we'd be all ready for them, we'd be able to barrel after them. Well, and then we'd sit there hour after hour, and we've already heard how boring that can be. But we were sitting up there, you know, you loosen up your shoulder harness and you relax, you sit back there, helmets on the side of your head, just listening, and you'd be about a mile away from your buddy, and the other cup guys are over there. This was referred to as a tight Air Force formation. But at least we were all ready to go after them. So then we'd get a message that the bogey was coming down, that would be a kamikaze, and we'd, of course, throw it into our PMs and then head on up in the direction that they vectored us to. And sure enough, we'd see this little son of a gun, and he was barreling on. Now, incidentally, we found out later, the kamikazes were only taught to take off. They weren't supposed to ever learn how to land. So, but that's beside the point. Anyway, this guy started, is there anybody in here that was a Navy on a destroyer escort? If you're in here, those guys, as far as I'm concerned, spend as much time underwater as they did on top. But the kamikazes were told, now the first ship that you see will probably be an American ship, start diving on it. And there's a book up in the library called The Sacred Warrior. I had no idea, nor did anybody else out there, as to the amount of damage and the number of people they killed and the number of air ships that they sunk. It was just devastating. And but anyway, this guy he's barreling on down. He's ready to go after this little destroyer escort. And of course, the 4 of us we all want to become aces, so we all peel off and we're going after him too. We weren't getting in close enough, and the people on the ship weren't quite sure whether we were going to do any damage, and the airplane would go and destroy them. So they started shooting at the kamikaze. Of course, they missed him, and we see black smoke in front of us. That black smoke represented shells with thousands of little shrapnels in there, and it was we decided the kamikaze may be ready for the 21 virgins in the next life. We all decided we'd like to know them in this life, so we peeled on off, and he blew on up in front of us. So we all took credit for it, and probably everybody aboard the ship there probably took credit for it also. One other time, we're sitting up there grinding around, it gets boring. We have a little navigation board underneath the dash, and you pull that out, and some of the guys would take a magazine and set it on there, and we'd read and look around, make sure that our buddies that were a mile away were safe, and we'd doing that, and the next thing you'd get a call, and of course you had to get rid of that. I had a Reader's Digest magazine I almost finished, but anyway, we went off racing after this guy, and before we could get to him, he got right down on the water, and he, excuse me, and he went between the carriers that were down there. Well, the carriers were picking up, shooting at him out here. Pretty soon they went right by their own carrier. Here they are shooting at each other. So these Japanese were pretty smart in that regard. Let's see, we got the men to stand up before I've got one other. May I have all the women that are wives, lovers, or what have you, of the docents stand for just a moment. I want the wives, Helen, Rana, all you gals. You never get credit for ironing their shirts. They'll stay up there and packing their, give them a round of applause. they pack their little brown bags and send them down here, and we don't give them the credit that they deserve. I want two other people. Blaine, will you come up? And Helen, will you come up, please? Oh, yeah. Now, I've got the microphone, so he doesn't have any choice. This fellow puts together more beautiful missions and stories of what we're doing here. And his wife, Helen, bless her heart, she's out here for every one of these. And I just can't help but want to say thank you to you two. You make this museum the beautiful place it really is. And we're very grateful for people like this. And Ellen, thank you for what you've done too. Oh, yeah. All right, he's got the hook and he's getting ready to get rid of me. So, Greg, I might also add, he goes out to schools and brings the children on in and hasn't come in by bus. I mention this because we need the docents to tell them what we did in the World War II and why we have what we have on display. In a matter of a few months, we're going to have some real hot weather, and a lot of the snowbirds are going to leave, and we will need some backup. So give some thought to being a docent. It'll be well worth your time. We have Dick Clark, who now is running the Air Museum, and God, the place has become so enjoyable, and the men are all, their morale has gone up a great deal. So we have him. And one last one. Is there a lady by the name of Monty? Would you come up, please?
Oh, no.
Oh, yes. I mention this because, for two reasons. Number one, she saved my life. And I mean that truly. I was wining and dining her and sending her love messages in the morning. And this one particular morning, I couldn't get my hands to work. And she had taken care of my husband for 15 years, paralyzed on one side. She detected something wrong, and she said, I'm coming over. And I said, I'll fix bacon and eggs for you. She came over and took one look at me, and she said, we're calling 911. I said, what do you think's wrong? And she said, I think you've had a stroke. And a little stroke, what's the big deal? It's like being a little pregnant. But I spent the whole month of September at Eisenhower. I wouldn't recommend that as a summer vacation for you. But this gal came down every day and made sure I was comfortable and healthy and so on. But along with that, she decided that I might be around for a while. And we were ready to go to New York and get married at Niagara Falls. And I decided I didn't want to fly that far. And besides, I was in intensive care for 4.5 weeks. So many of you, with your prayers and your love, brought me back. And I want to thank you so much. But anyway, Dick, bless his heart, along with Bill Hughes, arranged Monty's idea. She says, why don't we get married at the Air Museum? You had a lot to do with it. And I said, gee, that's neat. And they pulled the F-6F out. And we had some wonderful pictures taken. And I have to thank all of the support of you folks, my wonderful lady here. And I'm just grateful to be on top of the ground. And I'm trying to make a good comeback. Thank you all for showing up.